Far too often, writers think of exposition as the enemy, something to be avoided at all costs. But this isn't the case at all. In fact, some amount of exposition is necessary to immerse the reader in your story and provide them the necessary contextual information for them to register what's at stake for the characters. As a developmental book editor, exposition is something I very frequently discuss with the authors I work with. So today I want to demystify exposition and talk about some tactical strategies you can use to effectively convey exposition in your story. I'm going to present this as some do's and don'ts that are hopefully easy to follow and implement. If you're new to my channel, every week I post videos with either writing tips like this one or insight into the publishing industry, which is my professional background. So if you haven't subscribed and are interested in any of that, I recommend doing so. I also have a link in the description below to download my free story self-assessment. This is a worksheet that I designed to help you assess your own work and determine what needs to be revised to take it to the next level. That is also going to sign you up for my newsletter, where I provide exclusive tips and insights that are not available on my channel. So definitely grab that as well. Now let's talk about the first tip for exposition, which is that you do want to clarify when and where your story is taking place. The fear of exposition all too often leads writers to being overly vague in the opening scenes of the story, such that the reader can't tell where we are, when we are in the world's history, and therefore it just leads to the story feeling placeless. Sometimes it's not even revealed until a third or halfway through the book where we actually are locationally. This makes the reader ultimately feel disoriented. So in the first 20 or so pages, make sure that you answer the following questions. Is the story taking place contemporarily, or is it taking place in the past or in the future? Roughly what year is it? The reader should have some idea. Also, where are we geographically? Is this a real world location? Is it a fantastical location? Or is it an imagined location within our real world, such as a fictional town in Maine? Ultimately, these answers are going to help the reader gauge how the story's world is the same as and different from our actual world. We need a sense of how much it aligns with our world and how much it departs from our world, because that's going to be what allows us to register the rules of the story's world and the character's circumstances. My first don't for writing exposition is probably what you are all thinking. Do not info dump right at the beginning of your story. Even though you want to answer the questions that I just laid out, you do not want to do so by providing a long explanatory passage right in the opening pages of your story. This could read something like, it's the year 1912, and the city of London is reeling from the sinking of the Titanic. You can tell that this type of passage is adopting almost a textbook-like tone, and it frankly feels like the narrator is spoon-feeding us information. This is ultimately why exposition gets a bad rep, because it is conflated with this type of info dumping that ultimately takes us out of the narrative and is just not engaging. A good trick to use to recognize info dumping in your own work is to take out the exposition paragraphs or sentences and see if they can stand on their own. If they can stand on their own, like the one I read aloud, then it is likely that you are actually info dumping, because it indicates that this information is not baked into the narrative itself. You are actually pausing or departing from the main narrative to then provide this sidebar where you go into all the setting details, etc. So anytime you feel like you're putting on your narrator cap to divulge information to the reader, think twice and take a look at if you're actually info dumping. My next do for writing exposition is to weave in contextual information as it becomes relevant in the story. Rather than info dumping, you want to reveal the expository information through the narrative itself. So go ahead and kickstart the plot action. Go ahead and describe a character and their experiences. But then within those descriptions, you want to weave in mentions of the setting and other expository details. So for instance, you could say something like, walking down Hyde Street in downtown London, Anna noticed a headline on a newspaper under her feet, Titanic wrecked by iceberg. This way, the reader learns the expository information, A, that it is 1912, and B, that we are in downtown London, but without actually departing from the narrative. The story is still going. We're still immersed in the action of the scene. The exposition is woven into the descriptions of what Anna is doing. This way, you maintain plot momentum and kickstart the story's action while delivering the necessary background context that the reader needs to register what's going on. The next don't is don't include extraneous details. Whether your setting is real or fantastical, you do not want to include expository information that ultimately isn't relevant or pertinent to the plot events. You only want to deliver the exposition that the reader needs in order to follow and understand the story, no more and no less. So in the case of a sci-fi or fantasy novel, for instance, you might have developed a whole complex political structure and social hierarchy for your world. However, if the details of the social systems and political systems don't actually manifest in the story itself, don't tell us about them. Only tell us what we need to know to follow the plot progression. You don't want to overload the reader with information that doesn't end up becoming relevant in the story, because again, this is going to distract from the main narrative. But the same even goes for a real setting. So going back to the example of it being London in 1912, you don't necessarily need to go into all the details about the members of parliament and what types of laws they're considering passing in 1912, unless those become relevant in the story. It's just going to ultimately slow down the pacing and distract us from the main plot action. My last do for writing exposition is do illuminate the protagonist's backstory and motivations. While I've mostly been talking about setting in this video, another critical component of exposition is the character's circumstances, specifically your protagonist's circumstances. We need to understand what has led the main character or characters to this present moment, because that's going to be what allows us to register the stakes of the story and ultimately connect with those characters and invest in them. You want to give the reader an idea of who your protagonist is and what they've been through, ideally in the opening pages of the story. Think about questions like, what events have led them to their current situation in life? What does their life look like in this particular moment? Where are they from and where are they living now? Most importantly, what are their goals? What are they going after? And what is stopping them from achieving that? Without these details, the reader is ultimately not going to extend empathy to your protagonist and likely just isn't going to get invested enough in their journey to continue reading. My final don't for writing exposition is don't overshadow the main narrative. At the end of the day, all of the problems with exposition that I've outlined boil down to this single point. It's when the exposition takes the reader out of the main narrative action, therefore slows down the pace of the story and makes the reader disengage. You don't want exposition to ever interrupt the flow of the story. We should ideally instead get bits and pieces of exposition as the plot progresses and as we are getting to know the characters and watching them interact with their environment. If it ever feels like you're abruptly pausing or halting the narrative action to provide a deluge of expository information, that's a sign that you need to rethink how you are delivering that information, and if you can instead break it up and weave it in bits and pieces throughout the scenes. I hope this video helped you rethink your approach to exposition and understand what is effective exposition and what is ineffective info dumping. I hope you understand now that exposition is a necessary component of your storytelling. It is not something to fear or to avoid. Let me know in the comments if you've ever struggled with exposition, or potentially what techniques you use to deliver exposition and establish your story's setting and your character's circumstances at the beginning of your story. If you're interested in more tips on how to craft an effective opening, check out my video on the most effective novel openings. I go into more tips there. As always, if you haven't already, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. It helps me grow this amazing community that I have grown to appreciate so much. And don't forget to grab your free story self-assessment that's waiting for you in the description below. Thank you so much for watching and happy writing.